a few years ago, I recorded a solo episode about the 5 gifts that came from quitting weed. And I know it got a lot of traction. I've gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of positive stuff. And I know it's helped to inspire many of you. So thank you for the support. With that said, I wanted to do a follow up video on the 7 gifts that came from quitting weed. And you have to imagine, like, I quit weed when I was in jail back in 2008 on felony drug charges. And a lot of these benefits, these gifts that I'm about to share and that I have shared in the past happened during the time when I was behind bars. And the first thing that comes to mind is anxiety. My anxiety pretty much went away. So, when I first started to smoke weed, I did it because I wanted to numb the pain and I wanted to fit in. And what it really did was it caused much more anxiety in my life. It caused paranoia. It caused phobias. It caused panic attacks. And I remember, like, when I was getting high, I would feel ashamed of myself because I was the only one in my friend group that would start to panic whenever I got high. And it didn't happen initially. This was a compounding effect over time with me developing more of a tolerance and smoking more. And, I don't know the exact cause of it, but I do know that I read that, there's a certain percentage of people, at least back then when there was a lot less THC content, certain percentage of people, like, weed would cause paranoia. And I think obviously it was because, I mean, not just of the substance, but where I was at in my life and what was going on, but it made my anxiety so much worse. I mean, my anxiety was so bad back in the day that I ended up in the hospital twice for panic attacks. And I thought that I was dying both times. And weed played a massive part of that. And when I say, that I was doing a lot of weed, like, it got to the point where I was smoking a quarter ounce of pot every single day. And when I went to jail, I mean, obviously the first few days and the detox was pretty brutal, but after that, and after I got like a baseline, and after I started to recalibrate things and quit, my anxiety got so much better, and the panic attacks went away, and my life got better. And the things that I also had to do, I will share to help with that, is I had to find new coping strategies, right? Because being somebody that when I was younger, I used weed as a way out, as a way to numb the pain. That again ended up causing all this anxiety. But I had to find these other tools so that I could make up the difference, if you will, because life still happens. And the things that obviously helped me are things like fitness, exercising, moving my body, setting goals, changing the perception of myself, and learning to sit in the discomfort. Like, that was a huge thing for me, specifically when I was in jail, that helped me get better with dealing with anxiety. So what I've learned with my own personal journey, especially with anxiety, is sometimes you just have to stop the bleeding. And a big thing for me was giving up weed when I was behind bars when I was 21, because it just essentially got rid of all the panic and all the fear that went with that. And it's tough to say again that was it the THC that directly impacted it. I mean, I think it played a massive role based on what I've learned about it. I also think because of what addiction does, it wrecks your life, and you end up, creating circumstances that you're more prone to, freaking out, panicking, and living in fear because of the life that you've created. So it definitely alleviated a lot of my anxiety and panic around those things. So that's the first thing. Second thing is mental clarity and emotional intelligence. When I was smoking a bunch of weed, I was emotionally unregulated. I couldn't manage my emotions. I couldn't deal with stress. I couldn't, like, think through problems. I couldn't, like, do anything without my first thought being like, hey, I need a substance like weed to numb the pain or to numb whatever it is I'm going through. And then when I gave it up, when I stopped, when I was in jail, I was able to start to think clearly and problem solve in real time without kind of this panic. I talked about panic earlier, but without kind of freaking out in the moment, and without snapping or flipping out. Like, my emotional intelligence and well-being just got better. And I think part of it is because that I used to hear that smoking weed like stunted your emotional growth. And I don't know the science behind that. I mean, I do think it impacts brain development. I've talked about that on the podcast before with other experts, but I know for me, it definitely anecdotally stunted my emotional growth, and I was more emotionally immature than the average person my age, I think. And when I stopped smoking weed, my emotional maturity got so much better because I started to make better decisions in my life. I wasn't as reactive, and when you do that, things get a lot better in your life. And I think that was very clear for me because I was able to think better. I was able to think about who I was as a person a little bit more intelligently, and therefore that led to having better outcomes in life. And again, it all started with me giving up weed and quitting the weed when I was in jail because again, that led to more mental clarity and better emotional intelligence. And that leads into the third gift, which is that my brain healed. Now, that was a huge worry of mine. It's a worry of many other people's when they are, you know, smoking an excessive amount of weed. Is that like, is your brain ever going to heal? Because we used to see the commercials back in the day, at least when I was growing up, you'd see like the frying pan with the egg, and that was like your brain on drugs. And so I was like, man, my brain is going to be like completely damaged for the rest of my life. Like, is this ever going to get better? And that was a big concern of mine. And I got to admit, like, I thought that I was just destined to live the way I was living because, when I quit weed and when I was in jail, like I had memory issues. I couldn't remember like what I did the day before. My long term memory was definitely impacted. I talked about the emotional intelligence part, but I'm talking about when I'm talking about like my brain healed. I'm talking about it from a neurological perspective. I'm talking about like my ability to have like cognition and think, and because before I quit, my brain was very cloudy. I could barely like think straight, and I was in a daze like the whole time. So it was tough to really have any kind of conscious awareness around anything when I was doing. And what I learned is that when I quit, like my brain did heal, and it took time. I mean, it took at least a few weeks to get out of the initial um, days, if you will. But then after that, like it's just slowly over time, my brain started to recalibrate itself, and I started to be able to remember things again. My short term memory improved, my long term memory improved. Again, I could problem solve a lot more effectively. I had my personality back. I became more charismatic. I started to again be able to think about my life in a much more positive way because I had made this decision, to improve my life and quit weed and to make that. And I made the decision when I was behind bars. And then over time, obviously my brain healed. And that came from, that came from me continuing to exercise, take care of myself, stay in recovery, nourish myself with nutrition in a very positive way, focus on my sleep, stress reduction, that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, my brain definitely healed, and it was very surprising to me because given the amount of drugs I was doing, I was like, man, my brain is like gone forever. But really thankful that it actually ended up healing over time when I quit weed. And so if you're watching this, just know you got to be patient with it. It's going to take some time, but eventually, like due to neuroplasticity, and if you continue to improve yourself in your life, like your brain will heal itself and it will get better. The fourth gift is that my relationships improved drastically. And so when I was smoking a bunch of weed, I was knee deep in addiction as well. And addiction just wrecks families, it wrecks relationships. And I honestly didn't have that great of a relationship with my parents when I was a teenager because of the choices I was making with drugs. And as a matter of fact, like I got kicked out of my mom's house on my 16th birthday. My parents were divorced. Um, because I was weighing out a little bit of weed to sell to a neighbor, and because I was getting high, I got kicked out of her house. And back then, like weed was seen as a much more I guess dangerous substance, if you will, and people were really concerned about it. And so, she did what was best in the best interest of our family, and I went and go live with my dad full time. And it obviously had horrendous effects on my own mental health and well-being. But, I had my choice in that. And the reason I bring this up is, like, when I was a pothead, I mean, I was hiding a lot. I was lying a lot. I was manipulating. I was just doing whatever I could to get high because that was survival for me. Right. And because of that, I was very reactive towards my family. I didn't tell the truth. I said things I shouldn't have said. And that carried on like throughout high school where, I wasn't honest with myself. I wasn't honest with people around me. I settled in relationships, in friendships, because I thought that was the way it was supposed to be. Instead of having a backbone and standing up for myself, like I did whatever I could to fit in and people please. And when I finally, quit weed when I was in jail, I started to make better decisions about the types of people I wanted in my life. I didn't want to spend time with people that were doing drugs anymore. I wanted to spend time with people that were, doing things with their life. I wanted to have my own values and say in life, and I didn't want to just do things because I thought other people wanted me to. And then I also like decided how I wanted to show up for other people. And I just said, like, I'm not going to be this guy who manipulates people anymore. I'm not going to be somebody that is emotionally reactive. I'm not going to be someone that is unreliable. I'm not going to be someone that just uses other people because, back in the day, it was like the friends that I had, it was like, are you either getting high with me? Am I selling you drugs? Am I buying drugs from you? Like, if you weren't doing those things, like, I really didn't want to be around you. And that's a really crappy way to live life. Right. And I think people do that in other ways, too. But, for me, I just I wanted to have integrity, and I wanted to make sure that I had deep, meaningful relationships. And, I learned a lot of that, when I gave up weed, because you have to remember, when I quit weed, I quickly found out who my friends were. Because when you're in the drug game, when you're in the addiction world, you're doing whatever you can to survive. And then you're hanging out with so many different people that you think are your friends. And then the minute you escape and you kind of get out of that world, you'll find out like who is actually like in your corner and who's not. Because you'll have people that are like, you're a wuss. Why are you doing this? I can't believe you're doing this to us. You're young, you're acting like you're old, whatever the case may be. And then you also have guilt. Like, I had some survivor's guilt about being the one that left, and you start to just negatively spiral if you're not careful. And what this taught me was, I had to stand on my own 2 feet, and I had to stick to what I wanted. And in turn, my relationships over time improved because I started to spend time with people who actually liked me for me, and not just people that liked me, liked a certain version of me, or people that like just wanted to be around me because I had drugs or whatever back in the day. So my relationships overall definitely improved once I quit weed. A huge gift that I think isn't talked about. The number 5, this is kind of obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious in certain ways, is I had more money. The amount of money I spent on weed as a kid is insane. Like, it's wild. I mean, I forget the exact amount, but I mean, I was spending, probably at least 70, 80, 90, $100 a day on weed. And that's not even counting the money I was spending on other drugs too. But, for the sake of this conversation, like, I was spending a lot of money on weed back in the day. And, that compounds, right? I mean, conservatively, just say $50 a day. That's $350 a week. That's almost $1,500 a month that I was spending on weed. I mean, that's a lot of money, right? And so, obviously having that money back in my pocket is definitely a net positive. The other thing that, I haven't really talked about as much, but I've talked about it, is when I went to jail, I had 21 jobs by the time I was 21. And it was very kind of it was embarrassing, obviously, for my resume, but also like the reason that I would quit jobs or get fired is because I was too high to show up, or I would quit because I was like, hey, I can go make more money, selling weed than working here, or I wanted to leave because I wanted to get high and I couldn't get high at work, all the things. And I would get fired, I would quit. And therefore I lost a bunch of money. And so when I went to jail, and then when I got out of jail, I had a lot more stability in my life, after quitting weed. And then I was able to finally hold a job, which was a big deal to me. And therefore, not only am I building my resume and teaching myself discipline, all those things, I'm actually starting to now like compound some money and save money that I didn't have before. So that was a huge win for me because, like, again, the amount of money I was spending on drugs back in the day, I mean, it's quite embarrassing to admit. And then the fact that I couldn't keep a job because of my addiction just made things worse for a completely different reason. And when I stopped all that, my financial well-being got so much better. Number 6 is my confidence dramatically improved. And when I was growing up, like, I didn't have any confidence. I had horrible self-esteem, bad anxiety, as I mentioned before, and I just didn't know how much confidence I would get by quitting drugs. Like, I had no idea. And I think the reason I became more confident is multifaceted because I think as a kid, I was picked on a lot. I did whatever I could to fit in, and weed became the mechanism to cope with that. Became the mechanism to numb the pain. That also became the mechanism to just be around people that I wouldn't have been around because I had weed or they wanted to get high with me or whatever the reason was. And then like my confidence kind of sunk because I didn't have any kind of identity for myself and I didn't like who I was. I hated the life I had created. I hated that I couldn't give up drugs even though I wanted to. And when I finally was able to quit, I mean, I had this massive wave of confidence. And, I got to say, like, most of the confidence that came from it happened when I was behind bars. It was during that initial time when my life was a mess and I didn't have any belief in myself. And I turned to fitness. Thankfully, my cellmate got me into working out and I was able to do a set of 10 push-ups and run a mile by the time I left jail. And that was a huge accomplishment for me because when I first got started exercising in jail, I could barely do a push-up from my knees. I could barely walk up and down the steps. And so this was a huge, huge deal and a huge confidence booster. And then that, paid dividends into how I felt about myself. And I think if I could boil it down, I think a lot of the confidence came from not just like the exercise, not just from the fact that I like was, not, spending time with certain people that brought me down or that I was abusing a substance. It was because I finally like chose myself and did the right thing for my life and told myself that I deserved it and that I wanted more for myself. That's where all the confidence came from. It was choosing me, choosing my values and saying, Doug, like, you're not going to be this person anymore, and then sticking to it. And so when I gave up weed, so much more confidence came because I was actually taking care of myself and following through with my word. It was following through with doing the things that I told myself that I was going to do. And the 7th gift is I learned how to finally deal with discomfort and adversity in a healthy way. Growing up, I faced a lot, of adversity. And, my parents got divorced. I was picked on a lot in school. I mean, I wasn't the best athlete, even though I love sports. And because of that, I started to think of myself as a failure. And, weed became this coping mechanism that numbed all the pain and became this thing that I would use to deal with all of my problems, and then that compounded into an addiction, and then that also led to me doing other harder drugs, and including things like OxyContin, which I became heavily addicted to. I was snorting hundreds of milligrams of OxyContin up my nose every single day as well, and it's because of my inability to deal with stress and pain in my life, and it started with me using weed as a coping strategy and teaching my brain that the only way I could deal with life was by using substances. And as a result, obviously, things got very bad for me. I almost, I could have easily died. And, thankfully I went to jail, which ended up saving my life. But I share this because, when I was behind bars and I got the drugs out of my system, I was forced to deal with hardship and adversity in healthy ways. Otherwise, my life would have gotten worse. I could have gotten more jail time or whatever. And that built like a great blueprint for me for how to deal with adversity now because, life still happens. I still get stressed and all the things, but the way I deal with things is totally different. And that pays dividends like downstream in your life. I mean, it leads to more confidence, better self-esteem, better relationships, like all the things. And I think all that starts with like, how do you deal with adversity? How are you showing up when life gets hard? And, when I stopped using substances like weed to numb the pain and to try to suppress the feelings and the negativity in my life, I mean, things got much better because I didn't create more problems. Like when adversity happens, I think a lot of people create more problems in their life based on how they choose to respond to situations. And when I was using, weed to numb the pain, obviously my life got much worse as a result of it. And then like I had no idea why my life had gotten bad because, I became so addicted to these substances that it took this wake up call in jail to be like, oh, like it wasn't just my childhood. It was how I was behaving in the substances as to why my life is so bad. And so, once I learned how to deal with adversity in a very in a much more healthy way, obviously now in the years past when things have gotten bad, I don't just I don't make my life much worse in that moment. I've realized some things that work for me to ride the wave of adversity, use it to my advantage, and make things better overall. So these are 7 gifts that came from quitting weed. Again, it's a follow up to the first solo video I did a couple years ago. Hopefully this inspires you. I would love to hear your feedback in the comments below. Thanks for watching.